Before we get started, I'd like to recognize a special member of the Reagan Library team. Governor Pete Wilson served this fine state for 8 years and in the Senate for 6 during the Reagan administration. Please join in welcoming Pete Wilson and his wife, Gail. It's always great to have you guys here. It is my honor to welcome you here today to the symposium co-sponsored by the Central Intelligence Agency. There are a lot of people that have helped make this possible. Unfortunately, though, I can't name them individually or else, well, you know how it goes. Seriously, the women and men who serve the agency, quite often without recognition, deserve our thanks and gratitude. As he often did, President Reagan said it best, quote, "Whether you work in Langley or a faraway nation, whether your tasks are in operation or analysis section, it is upon your intellect, your integrity, your wit, your intuition, that the fate of freedom rests for millions of your countrymen and for many millions more around the globe. You are the tripwire across which the forces of oppression and tyranny must stumble in their quest for global domination. You, the men and women of the CIA, are the eyes and ears of the free world. All of us here at the library want to say thank you for your great work." And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Director of Information Management Services from the CIA, Mr. Joe Lambert.
Thank you, Duke. I think we all owe you a sincere thank you for making this spectacular venue available today to showcase the declassification and release of the CIA and Presidential Library records. On behalf of our director and our Chief Information Officer, I want to thank you very much for coming. Hope you enjoy the afternoon. Almost every day I get to go to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. I walk in through the main entrance. I walk across the agency seal on the floor, and the one that you've seen in the spy movies. I walk past a statue on the left of William Donovan, former director of the Office of Strategic Services. I didn't know there was a ghost of William Donovan that lived at the Ronald Reagan Library. I walk past the memorial wall where, on the right side, where there is chiseled a star for agency officers who lost their life in the line of duty. There are 102 stars on that wall today, 49 of which have been added since I've been working at CIA. I go past a couple of guards with really big guns, up a few steps, and right in front of a bust of Vice President George Bush, former director of CIA, I turn left. I go down a hallway, and at the end of that hallway, there's a mural of the Statue of Liberty. Below that mural is printed the agency's motto. It reads, "We are the nation's first line of defense. We accomplish what others cannot accomplish, and we go where others cannot go." Well, in order to accomplish those things and to go to those places, much of what we do must necessarily remain secret. If our adversaries had access to this information, our methods would quickly become ineffective. So as you can imagine, we take this declassification business very seriously. Information Management Services, the office that my deputy Dan Sullivan and I lead at CIA, actually have the privilege to lead at CIA, is responsible for the records of the CIA, records that, due to the nature of the business, remain secret for a very long time. Although operating a secret intelligence organization in a democracy has inherent tensions, as an organization, we believe that we hold these records in trust for the American people. And in fact, when their sensitivity attenuates over time, we have a duty and a responsibility to release them so the American people can see for themselves. Our last director, Leon Panetta, a Californian, once said to me, "Joe, how do you decide when a secret is no longer a secret?" About the only thing I could come up with was, "Sir, it's a very, very difficult task," to which he immediately agreed and offered that he was glad that he didn't have to personally do it himself. Fortunately, at CIA, we have very dedicated, very experienced officers who go line by line, page by page, through millions of pages of documents each year, protecting what they must in the interest of national security and releasing what they can in the interest of the American people. These officers work under incredibly tight time deadlines and by and large without any expectation of acknowledgement whatsoever. So I'm going to break tradition right now, and if you work in Information Management Services or CSI at CIA, would you please stand? Thank you very much. Thousands of hours go into declassification projects like the one we are engaged in today. These folks that just stood a minute ago spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours and have worked for this particular event for the last 2 years. Finding documents, redacting documents, and ultimately releasing documents. History is a very fluid thing, and what we know about the past is always subject to reassessment when new information arises. The reason we look forward to events like this conference today is they provide a wonderful opportunity to re-examine the narratives that accompany pivotal events in our nation's history. The document collection that we're talking about today challenges some of the most persistent misconceptions about intelligence leading up to the end of the Cold War. The myth, for example, that President Ronald Reagan was an unsophisticated consumer of intelligence provided by the CIA. Or the contention that U.S. policymakers were blindsided by the fall of the Soviet Union due to a failure of intelligence. When you arrived, you were given a booklet. On the back page of that booklet, you'll find a DVD. That DVD contains all of the declassified documents from today's event. It also contains a variety of videos that were produced for President Reagan, photographs, maps, and a variety of other things. It is a treasure trove of information, and I highly recommend that you look at it when you have a chance. Now, before I get 1,000 calls back in Washington that it doesn't work, the DVD is designed for your computer and not the DVD player attached to your television. So I'm excited to hear the fantastic speakers we lined up for today, so I want to close. But before I do that, I want to recognize a couple of current and former senior CIA officers who are in attendance today. Peter Clement, our Deputy Director for Intelligence, is here. You'll hear from him here on the podium shortly. Jeannie Tysinger, our Chief Information Officer, is with us today. Without her leadership, events like this simply do not happen. Admiral Inman, former Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, is with us today, and you'll hear from him here on the podium as well. And we have a gentleman who at CIA needs no introduction at all because he's a legend. Former officer in the Office of Strategic Services, and charter member of the CIA in 1947, and that's Major General John Sinkloud. Welcome. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy it, especially the young folks in the audience today who are the next generation of history makers. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. It's interesting in our business at the National Archives when you have conferences or symposium like this and you realize how open our society is. I think that's extremely important, and we should feel fortunate as American citizens that we're able to do that. Well, when Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, it is doubtful that anyone would have predicted the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union a decade or so later. No one, that is, except Ronald Reagan. President Reagan had a vision and the resolve to set a course that changed the world and made it a safer place. But he also knew the importance of a strong military as well as good intelligence. As you will learn today, information provided to the president and his advisors is critical. In all fairness, things weren't always easy, nor were there full agreement on the course of action. And those disagreements probably caused some consternation in Washington. Today, we offer an insightful look at that amazing period of our history. We have assembled a stellar group of speakers and panelists who will provide important perspectives and perhaps some lively discussion. Our keynote was there on the front lines with Ronald Reagan. And we are quite fortunate to have him with us today because he graciously agreed to modify his schedule so he could be here. But unfortunately, he has to leave at the break because he has to catch a red-eye to go back to New York this evening. Ken Edelman has an impressive resume. Author, professor, senior government official, arms control expert, as well as ambassador. But there's a few other things that you might not know about him. In a program he called Movers and Shakespeare's, he uses the lessons learned from Shakespeare to teach leadership to top executives. Being a Renaissance man, he also took part in the Zaire River expedition in 1974, traveling down the Congo River on the 100th anniversary of Henry Morton Stanley's legendary expedition. Ken even translated for Muhammad Ali at the Rumble in the Jungle fight with George Foreman. One of the many highlights of his distinguished career was accompanying Ronald Reagan to the superpower summits with General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. All of this provides a unique perspective for our symposium today. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Ambassador Ken Edelman.
Thank you, Duke. That was a wonderful introduction. It was so much nicer than an introduction I had in Indianapolis when I was in office. And the fellow there from the Rotary Club said that I had been with Ronald Reagan for all these important things. I was in and out of the White House constantly. I knew everything that was happening. So he ended the introduction of me with a grand flourish. He said, "So listen up carefully and hear the latest dope from Washington. Here's Ken Edelman." Then about a year ago, I guess it's a year and a half ago now, I was giving a talk on security interests in Northeast Asia, and the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Tokyo, after my speech, got up, a wonderful Japanese man. After my speech, he got up and he said, "Ambassador Edelman, for your service to the free world and for your remarks today, you deserve much clap." I told him that was all right. Of all the things in the world I wanted, much clap was not one of them. But I really appreciated the sentiment on that. But it's an honor to be here today. And whenever I say that, I always think of the first commencement address Ronald Reagan gave as President of the United States. And it was at his alma mater, Eureka College. And he was there a few months after he was shot. And Reagan came out and he thanked the president and the faculty for giving him an honorary degree. And then he said, "It's wonderful to get an honorary degree from Eureka College. To tell you the truth, I always thought the first degree I got was rather honorary as well." And then he said, "Just the other night, I didn't get great grades here, but just the other night, I was sitting on the Truman balcony of the White House, and it was a starlit night, just beautiful. Nancy and I were sipping some wine. To the right, I look, and there's the Lincoln Memorial. Straight ahead, Washington Monument, and then the Jefferson Memorial. To the left, the Capitol Building." And I said, "Nancy, next week I'm going to Eureka College." She says, "Yes, I know, dear." He says, "I didn't get very good grades at Eureka College." She said, "Yes, I know, dear." He says, "There's no telling what I could have become had I really applied myself and really been diligent at Eureka College." I want to start today this symposium that is a very important and wonderful symposium on the role of intelligence in the Reagan administration by looking at the main question of that era and the main question I hope our panel goes and talks about today. And that is the question of, how did President Reagan get it really right on the big issues, the really big issues, when those of us who worked with him in the intelligence community, in academia, and policymakers, who had spent so much time, more time, on these issues than he did, who knew the subject so much better, who were, we thought, so much smarter, how did he get it right and we didn't? For starters, let's go to the finish. Clearly, by 1982, Ronald Reagan foresaw that communism would, as he stated publicly in 1982, quote, end up on the ash heap of history. According to Marty Anderson and a lot of materials I've read recently, it was in the 1970s that he worked out in his own mind how the Cold War would end. Namely, we win, you lose. The intelligence community didn't come to a conclusion like that until 1989, and even then with caveats and footnotes. For this tardiness, the CIA has been roundly criticized. But that's something of a bum rap, since the agency assessments had been moving in that direction for years. Besides, to conclude before 1989 that the Soviet Union would actually be relegated to the ash heap of history was not only unthinkable to the CIA, it was also unthinkable to the KGB. During the whole of the Reagan administration, such thinking was pie in the sky. Believed singularly by Ronald Reagan, we policy wonks, the real Soviet experts, we knew better, but we were wrong. I remember telling President Reagan one time, or 3 times, in fact, that I said, Mr. President, you know, since 1917, some 35 countries have gone from capitalism to communism. Not one country has ever gone from communism to capitalism. And it's unlikely that it's going to happen anytime soon. He looked at me, shook that head of his in his wonderful way, said, thank you, Ken. That's very interesting. Thank you, Ken. And then went on to say it again a few minutes later. For Ronald Reagan to believe that we could and would win the Cold War, and fairly soon, that idiosyncratic view is more than just, as Shakespeare would say, passing strange, or of academic curiosity now, for it had real policy consequences then, consequences that none of us, including Ronald Reagan, could ever imagine. Here's how. If you took the then conventional and quite convincing view that the US-Soviet rivalry was for all ages, as far as the eye could see, as far as the imagination could go, then you had to get along, avoid blowing each other up, and make do. The rivalry then became like a bad marriage without divorce, from which there was no escape, or in John Paul Sartre's play with the characters of No Exit. You strived as your goal to have the situation as least intolerable as you could make it. This mindset led to the liberals' view of US-Soviet accommodation, or to the Nixon-Kissinger view of hard, tough-minded détente. Yet, on the other hand, if you adopted the distinct mental construct that the US-Soviet competition was temporary, that it would end soon with their losing and our winning, since their system contradicted human nature and therefore was illegitimate, and our system complemented human nature, allowing the full flowering of a human being and therefore was legitimate, then you took a radically different view. This approach, stemming, as I say, from a different mindset that Ronald Reagan had, broke with previous presidents, especially Nixon and Kissinger, who felt they had to adopt a realistic foreign policy, one that accepted Soviet power forevermore, one which would legitimize this predicament and legitimize the Soviet government. In contrast with Reagan's mindset and policy stemming from it, you'd be willing to sit down with the Soviets, but you'd also be willing to stand up to them. Moreover, you'd be game to adopt the so-called Reagan doctrine of vigorously challenging Moscow, rollback as it's called, but not as originally envisioned in Central Europe, but rather in Central America, in Central Asia, like Afghanistan, and in Central Africa, like Angola. Moreover, you'd confront it where it hurt them most, in the central nervous system. You'd engage mightily in the war of ideas. You'd say outright that the Soviets, quote, reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, end quote, to advance their age, their aims as Ronald Reagan did at his very first presidential press conference. Now, you have to understand, this was okay for a speaker on the GE circuits to say. It was okay for a speaker at the Republican National Convention to say. It's okay to say it in the Rotary Club. But for a president of the United States to say it at his first press conference, right there, setting the stage for diplomacy over the next 8 years, that was awfully new. Presuming that their government was illegitimate, you'd call the Soviet Union an evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world, and you'd cry out, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. All this stems from the unconventional mindset that Reagan somehow adopted. Similarly, Reagan saw or felt the transforming nature of SDI. Now, a lot of us thought strategic defense was very helpful. In fact, I had written an article for the Heritage Foundation Policy Review a year before the inauguration saying we should really go revive strategic defense. But we considered it not revolutionary, but complementary to traditional deterrence. I was amazed in November of 1985 during the first summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, the first U.S.-Soviet summit in 7 years, when the Soviet delegation spent 75% of their time in very agitated nature about SDI. I remember taking aside Pat Buchanan, who was then the director of White House communications, and saying, Pat, don't they understand? This is just a presidential speech. After 2.5 years after the president gave his speech on March 23rd, 1983, advocating SDI, the Pentagon had done virtually nothing on it. It was just rhetoric. It was just presidential words. And I remember Pat saying, don't tell them that. They think it's a real program that the Pentagon has underway. Similarly, SDI became a make or break issue at the next summit, our best summit at Reykjavik 25 years ago last month. On that historic Sunday morning in October of 1986, we had negotiated, after we had negotiated in the Hofty House, from 8 o'clock at night till 6:20 in the morning. After I told President Reagan in a secure bubble, the room within the room, that were for top secret conversations, at about 8:30 in the morning, I said, Mr. President, we had accomplished more in the night before, previous evening, than we had for 7 consecutive years in Geneva, cumulatively on that. Gorbachev then played his SDI card. He tied all of our night's arms control agreements to the president either snuffing out or at least shaving down SDI. President Reagan, of course, stood his ground. There was no way that was going to happen. In short, the Soviets went nuts about SDI's possibilities, while people like me were going nuts about the Pentagon not beginning to work on SDI's possibilities. I now believe that Reagan's engaging vigorously in the war of ideas and launching SDI were most critical, not sufficient, but nonetheless critical in bringing down the Soviet Union. I say this to contradict today's common explanation, at least in some sophisticated circles, that the USSR collapsed because of its own internal decay, not because of any actions by any U.S. president, certainly not the one Clark Clifford, Washington's foremost wise man, called that amiable dunce, Ronald Reagan. Since it was rotten at the core, the Soviet Union had to collapse. So says this argument. But then you begin to wonder, just why did it have to collapse? History is replete with poor countries that either stay poor or get poorer, yet which do not undergo systematic revolution, and especially not a peaceful abandonment of the empire. The Turkish and Russian empires were poor and got poorer over several centuries, yet only the calamity of World War I brought a violent end to those empires. to assert the inevitability of the revolutionary Soviet breakup and the abandonment of empire is very simple-minded. It leaves out people from the historic portrait of that era. Now, to some in this chattering class, there is room for a portrait in that there is room for a face in that historic portrait of the era. And that face is of Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, mind you, Gorbachev deserves some of the credit, no doubt about that. But at some point, amidst all the adulation heaped on Mikhail Gorbachev, someone must apply the simple question that should be posed about any leader in history. And that question is, did that leader achieve her or his goals? Let's apply it here. On March 11th, 1985, did Mikhail Gorbachev set out to break up the Soviet Union, to toss it on the ash heap of history, to end its vast empire, and to totally discredit the ideology that he and especially his wife Raisa had proclaimed for their whole lives? Was this his goal? Were these his aspiration when lifting up his arm to take the oath of office that March day? Or are they a fairly neat summary of the goals and aspiration of that other fellow? The one the pseudo-intelligentsia will go to any length to avoid giving any credit to. That other guy who raised his arm to take the oath of office a few years before on January 20th, 1981. When all the pundits resort to either of these twin claims, the inevitability of it all due to Soviet decline, or Gorbachev's doing it all, they bring to mind George Orwell's nice quip that some ideas are so stupid that only an intellectual could have thought of them. I somehow began this talk at the end, so now let me scramble back to the beginning. To return to the question posed for our two panels this afternoon, what and how did intelligence do during the Reagan administration? Contrary to what I felt before researching the record very thoroughly for this talk this afternoon, the intelligence community did much better, fairly good in fact, a solid B+. Now I say this not only because the CIA is host to this great conference this afternoon, and being, Joe, as you know, a basically polite fellow, I'm not going to offend my host, but the record stands up very nicely. There was nothing like the massive intelligence failure that we had from 1995 actually to 2003 on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Instead was a solid record of reporting quite accurately, as it turned out, the status of Soviet forces, the woes of its geriatric rulers, the sliding fortunes of the Soviet economy, and Gorbachev's lack of coherence on these intractable problems. True, the CIA failed to predict the collapse of communism and the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was one of the seminal events of the 20th century. But as I said before, so did the KGB, so did Gorbachev, so did the Politburo, so did the Supreme Soviet. The decades of CIA economic analysis has been controversial. It's treated very thoroughly by Doug McCheekin here and Bruce Berkowitz that you'll hear this afternoon, and by wonderful books that go with it. But to gallop through this grand terrain, in the 1970s, the CIA estimated Soviet defense spending at 6% of its GNP. This was clearly off base. The problem stemmed from the intelligence community hyping the overall size of the Soviet economy, which lowballed the defense burden on the smaller than estimated economy. The intelligence community then deemed the Soviet GNP half the size of the United States GNP, where actually it was 1/3 or less. What's been dubbed a bombshell exploded in May of 1976 when the CIA recalibrated its ruble prices and costs and raised the appraisal of Soviet defense spending up to 11 to 13% of its GNP. I was then working as a special assistant. I was young and, to tell you the truth, not too special, to the young and very special Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld launched a veritable first strike against the then Director of Central Intelligence, George Herbert Walker Bush, for lowballing even this number. While Bush's CIA estimated 11 to 13%, Rumsfeld felt it was more like 13 to 15%. These two men, whose futures would hold even bigger jobs, had, I don't know how to put this gingerly, I would say a rather minimum regard for each other. President Ford valiantly tried to mediate, but soon his administration, and with it this angry, heated exchange, ended. Looking back, we can now see that their hot dispute, 11 to 13% versus 13 to 15%, is rather comical. Upon opening up the Kremlin kimono, we found the true figures were closer to 30% or even 40% of GNP. Both the Bush and the Rumsfeld estimates were off by more than a factor of 2. Again, to be fair, in the forest of analysis on Soviet military spending, like in much of intelligence, there's an epistemological difficulty. Just how do we know anything for sure? Like everything important in life, William Shakespeare illustrates this point beautifully. In an early scene in one of his wonderful plays, Othello, who is commander of Venice's military, is summoned by the Duke and senators. He's asked to fight a Turkish attack they just learned about. Othello needs to know how big an attack Turkey launched to size his own forces to repel that attack. In the 16th century Situation Room of Venice, the first intelligence briefer declares that Turkey has launched 107 ships. Now, mind you, it's not around 110. It's not more than 100. 107 ships. Sounds like he really knows what he's talking about, doesn't it? Until the next briefer comes along and says he has a very clear report that Turkey has launched 140 ships. Othello starts to look around the room, deciding, how do I know what's right around here? Until a senator comes in and he has a confirmed report that the Turks have launched 200 ships. Okay? As Macbeth says in another context, confusion now hath made his masterpiece. Everyone's confused, all right, especially when the scene ends, and yes, yet another intelligence officer rushes in directly from the front, telling the Turks have launched, the Turks have attacked, they are, quote, of 30 sails. Okay, the Venetians didn't know how many ships the Turks had launched. It was probably somewhere between 30 and 200, but we don't know for sure. Anyway, Othello didn't know and couldn't know, but presumably the Turks knew how many ships they launched. Now, in the case of the Soviet Union, as I'll talk about in 1 minute, I'm not sure they even knew that, but more about that. Presuming precision on what we think we know may be myopic at times. Complicating this already messy field of Soviet defense estimates were further doubts, not only whether the CIA was estimating these things right, but whether the CIA was even estimating the right things. During the Reagan years, the very gifted analyst Harry Rowan pushed for a grander definition, one that encompassed the Soviet Union's cost of empire. This category included costs of keeping the Warsaw Pact nations captive, of Cuba and Angola, of national liberation battles, and all that. It brought the agency's estimate to over 20% of Soviet GNP, which is closer, but as one beneficiary of the Soviet cost of empire would say in Havana, still no cigar. These battles over Soviet military and empire spending, fought on so many fronts over so many years, were actually of very minimum importance in the real world of evaluating the US and Soviet military balance. Why is this? Because a larger number didn't mean greater Soviet capability. Our technical collection showed and appraised these capabilities rather well. Instead, a larger number showed greater Soviet inefficiency. The issue became marginally important on a higher strategic plane, as it indicated the determination to which the Soviets would go to become and stay a global military power. Just how much the Kremlin would make its people sacrifice for its worldwide ambitions. But this issue wasn't minimum or even marginal to me. In arms control, it was major. Why? Because of the prevalent argument then that without arms control, the Soviets could break out and build an even greater military arsenal without having the, let's call them, blessings of the Office of Management and Budget, Congressional Appropriation Committee, congressional hearings, and an array of liberal anti-defense NGOs. A totalitarian regime like that in Moscow could accelerate quickly and leave us in the dust militarily. Yet, if Moscow was already allocating between 30 and 40% of its GNP, there was very little acceleration left in that engine. It was already doing as much as it possibly could be doing. After all, during the World War II life or death struggle for all of civilization, the United States allocated 32% of our GNP to defense in 1943, 36% in 1944, and the high-level mark was 37% in 1945. Hence, during the Cold War, the Soviets were allocating roughly what we had allocated during the hottest of all hot wars. Intelligence during the Reagan administration was, as before, the best in technical collection. There it counted most. What the CIA knew and watched, the SS-18s, the SS-24s, the SS-25s, virtually every strategic system that I had to deal with. Such thorough and accurate monitoring gave us a clear window on real Soviet capabilities. Hence, from the 1960s onward, and this is very important, including throughout the 1980s when we were in office, there were no real surprises from the Soviet weapons breakthrough. There were no bomber gaps, as in the 50s, no missile gap, as in 1960. The start of the U-2 monitoring in July of 1956 ended fears of a bomber gap. And the launch of intelligence satellites in 1961 proved the myth of the missile gap, though this came after John F. Kennedy won a very close election highlighting that very charge. We quickly learned that the Soviets were not building new ICBMs as quickly as the U.S. Air Force had forecasted. And in 1964, with Corona in the satellite, every single Soviet missile field had been located and photographed. Such thorough monitoring helped gauge Soviet compliance with arms control, but this was something of a mixed bag over the years. Personally, I became rather curious about all the fuss over verification, especially by my fellow conservatives. It was and remained the top of everybody's list of critical concerns, especially during the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan himself drove Mikhail Gorbachev fairly nuts with his constant refrain, "Dovieri, no provieri, trust but verify." It was a terrific slogan. It was crisp and rhyming in Russian, and a mighty wonderful sentiment. Yet I was unclear what, if anything, we'd actually do when our verification found their noncompliance. Not much, as it happened, much as I suspected. During our time in office, we found the Krasnoyarsk radar unambiguously in violation of the ABM Treaty, as it stood on the periphery of the Soviet missile field facing outward. Clear violation of treaty terms. Speaking of the periphery, let me add peripherally that this was a rare but important miss that for several years running, our overintelligence totally missed it. even though the radar was on, it was several football fields large and on the verge, on the edge of a Soviet missile field. Regardless, when all was said and done, a lot more would be said about verification than ever done because of it. My suspicions were confirmed during a White House luncheon in September 1987 with Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, who told President Reagan, after we pounded home the point, that Shevardnadze, he too thought the radar, the Krasnoyar radar, was in clear violation of the ABM Treaty. The more we pounded this issue hard, the more he agreed with us, which kind of took the air out of our balloon, I would say. And the more we said we wanted it, the whole Krasnoyarsk radar, several football fields large, removed, he again thwarted us by saying he too wanted it removed. Yet it was big, and it was expensive, and it was there, and he was foreign minister, and what's a fellow to do? Well, what could we do in such a predicament? I guess the only thing that tough-minded, red-blooded American conservatives could possibly do. We went on with another conversation and just enjoyed our dessert then being served. Throughout the Reagan administration and before came the argument that arms control was beneficial to U.S. intelligence gathering. Here, too, I was a bit skeptical. Arms control, on balance, probably hurt our overall intelligence gathering. For one thing, the Soviets never revealed anything they didn't want revealed, either in arms control or with the weapon systems to stay outside where we could photograph them in clear view of our satellites. At times, they didn't even want us to reveal much of anything. There's a wonderful episode in SALT I where Ambassador Gerard Smith, at the beginning of the SALT talks, he goes and he tells the Soviet counterpart or the Soviet delegation that he is going to now tell the number of American missiles in a certain category and the number of Soviet missiles in that category. And before he does, the head of the Soviet delegation stops and he says, Ambassador Smith, can I talk to you for a minute? The two delegations break, and he says, Ambassador Smith, members of my delegation, the Soviet delegation, are not cleared to hear the number of Soviet missiles that are on. So you can proceed, please, at telling the number of American missiles you have, but when you tell the number of Soviet missiles, please do it to me privately on that. One of those golden moments from arms control. To some degree, arms control damaged our real intelligence gathering by taking limited resources away from the military realm of appraising actual Soviet capabilities to the legalistic realm of appraising Soviet compliance with arcane and convoluted treaty language. Moreover, some arms control agreements closed up intelligence sources. We knew, for example, more about Soviet nuclear capabilities when they tested in the atmosphere, and a lot less after the test ban treaty pushed the Soviet tests underground, which ironically spiked up the number of nuclear tests. Under this treaty, which was the very pinnacle of Kennedy-era idealism, the Soviets increased their nuclear testing program and expanded their nuclear arsenal faster than before the treaty. Happily, the intersection of arms control and intelligence gathering got amusing at times. This was most welcome, since arms control was not the cheeriest of topics I've dealt with in my life. The CIA, for example, got very adept at identifying Soviet missile types by the kind of fences they built around a missile field. I envisioned some Russian manual of missile field fence construction that was carried around, which required SS-18s to have a different kind of fence than SS-17s. This is very important because all the missiles are in the silos. We could see the hatches, but we couldn't see what was inside of it. Allow me to brag a minute now. but as Satchel Paige once said, it ain't bragging if you done it. After a number of very thorough briefings, I became a true expert on Soviet missile field fences, a knowledge which, regretfully, I have not ever been able to call upon again in the past 25 years. Like all government agencies, the CIA spent gobs of resources on what turned out to be marginal or useless issues. This is endemic in government. Like what were General Secretary Konstantin Chernyenko's long-term plans for the Soviet economy, whereas he actually had no long-term plans for it or for anything, including himself. He died shortly after taking office, something like the Pope John Paul I of the Soviet sphere. There was a wonderful time when Brezhnev died, and then they had a state funeral, then you had Andropov, then you had Chernyenko. Carol and I, my wife, were very good friends with the Italian ambassador at that time. We were over at his house, and he was telling us he was going to Moscow for the funeral of, I think it was Chernyenko. And the Italian ambassador really loved opera. And I said to him, "You're really going to the funeral?" He says, "Yes, Ken, don't you understand? I bought tickets to the entire series." Likewise, I recall many hours wasted on the CIA overthinking Gorbachev's economic programs. Like that old story of horse meat in Oklahoma, the more you chew, the bigger it gets. On this, the more I learn, the bigger my ignorance. With growing frustration, I decided to sit down one evening and actually read an entire Gorbachev speech on the economy that was recently done. Initially, I figured the translation must be awfully confused. But then I realized it was Gorbachev who was awfully confused. He had absolutely no idea how his or any economy actually worked. Here, in the economic sphere at least, Gorbachev's record was one unblemished by success. While our guys were wasting their precious time and brains on peripheral or useless topics, I was consoled that their guys were too. This happened one great day. I was in my office in the Arms Control Agency, and the CIA briefer, who was then assigned to me, came in. He was kind of a dour fellow. He came in. I always heard this kind of Boris Karloff music playing in the background. And he said, "I have to shut the door and tell you something very, very serious." I said, "What's that?" He says, "We have it on very good information that your home phone is being bugged by the KGB." I bit my cheeks to help keep from laughing because I didn't spend that much time at home. And the time I spent there was with the family or being called back to the office for something. But we did have two early teen daughters who were 12 and 14. You can imagine, all of you, their routine in those days was go to school, rush home, get on the phone. We had one single line, and call each other and say what Megan had said to Susie, how Billy had looked at Steven, how Cheryl thought that Roger was doing. All this drivel for 8 hours ensuing after the school. And to think that there was a team of KGB officials with big earphones, not only taking down all this crap, all this stuff, but translating it into Russian, caused me great, great pleasure. I said, do nothing about trying to intercept those. Let them bug my phone. It's quite all right. So I figure that one time when all the KGB files are opened, there'll be a kind of frozen moment of our daughters right there for all of us to go through. And who is that? Remember, what did she say about Roger at that time? And all that. Being accurate on the large issues, but sometimes wasting a lot of resources on most marginal ones, the CIA missed some very big factors. Though admittedly I did not think it at the time, I am now convinced that we all missed, and the CIA especially missed, the huge impact of Chernobyl after its April 1986 meltdown. Not so much its economic impact, but its psychological and political impacts. For Gorbachev, the impact of such a terrifying nuclear incident led right to Reykjavik and his conversion to real nuclear reductions. For the Soviets, and especially the Ukrainian people, the hiding, cheating, lying, uncaring nature of their government, even under that communist with the human face, Gorbachev, that was it. For him, it seemed like the start of a genuine fear of these dastardly weapons. For them, it became the final straw in tolerating a disgusting government and system. Even under this good guy Gorbachev, the Kremlin denied news of the radioactive contamination for days and urged little boys and little girls to go out in normal and play in the area, to get infected, to get deformed, and to get killed as a result. Chernobyl, I now believe, brought on the finale of the delegitimization process that Ronald Reagan launched during his very first presidential press conference. Second, the intelligence community missed a lot in the political realm. Here again, we must be tolerant. U.S. policy officials are always asking what will be done by someone who hasn't made up his own mind yet, or even thought about doing anything at all. This brings up to the vital distinction in intelligence circles between a secret, something's knowable but is now hidden, and a mystery, something simply unknowable, at least for now. It was secrets we needed to know for arms control verification, but mysteries we needed to know for arms control negotiations. What, for example, was Gorbachev going to do at Reykjavik 25 years ago last month? Now, if I could have the photos of the Reykjavik up there, you will see a golden moment at that time. I can now, what we figured would stay a secret became revealed when Secretary of State George Shultz and the rest of us heard the definitive fact from the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, the CIA, the intelligence briefers, and everybody in the system that Gorbachev wouldn't do much at all at Reykjavik. Reykjavik would be a meet and greet event, a howdy and hello summit. Here is a scene from that Sunday afternoon. You can tell clearly that I've dyed my hair since then. It's actually jet black underneath that, but I decided to keynote this. I needed to have dyed hair. But this is on the second floor of the Hofty House, where the president came up 2 or 3 times that afternoon. This is right before he goes and he decides that he's going down to talk to Gorbachev for the very, very last time. The weekend at Reykjavik was, I'd have to say, the great weekend of my life. But I just must say that the KGB surely judged us very adept at disinformation. On the Sunday afternoon of October 12, 1986, when Secretary Shultz looked as if he had been kicked in the stomach at his final press conference at the International Press Conference in Reykjavik and declared that the Reykjavik summit was a dismal failure. While at the same time, I was being interviewed by Peter Jennings on ABC that Reykjavik was a great triumph. Okay, the summit broke down without an agreement. Reagan would not sacrifice SDI, even for all the arms control deals we had stuck during the long night at the Hofty House. But I reckon that the Soviets tying the night's arms control agreements to SDI was a summit bluff, a temporary ploy that they wouldn't long continue. They would go back to what we had done at Reykjavik, and a few months later they did. So we proceeded full steam ahead on the intermediate nuclear force, the only treaty ever to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. It was signed by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in the East Room in December of 1987. The previous March, I had told the president that if we could possibly get an INF agreement done, I would leave right after, having accomplished all and even more than we ever set out to do in the 7 years I was with the Reagan administration. So 2 days after Gorbachev parted from Washington, I parted from my grand office, which was previously occupied by Secretaries of State from Dean Acheson, Dean Rusk. Besides missing the importance of Chernobyl and much intelligence, political intelligence, the CIA missed opportunities. The whole intelligence community, again understandably, focused on threats to the nation and never on opportunities for the nation. Their reports were confined to elements which did or could endanger us, and not ever what did or could advance us. A final thought on the CIA's appraisal of Soviet defense spending. My weeks of poring through the mountains of documents on this, the ultimate intelligence secret of the 1980s, may have rattled my brain, as I've come to a very peculiar thought. This, the uber secret of how much the Soviet leadership spent on its military, may have actually been a mystery to the Soviet Union itself. Maybe no one knew. Not Gorbachev, who in 1990 publicly said that Soviet defense spending was 94 billion rubles. His top assistant, Ligachev, put it at 120 billion rubles. Foreign Minister Shevardnadze said at the same time it was 117 billion rubles. And the defense minister said it was 132 billion rubles. Sounds a lot like the estimates Othello was hearing of the number of Turkish ships, but in this case from the Turkish leaders themselves. Maybe something even we know for sure, like that there's a real distinction between a secret and a mystery, is itself untrue. My main point here is intelligence is awfully tough. There's a great scene in the movie The Lion in Winter where the king admonishes everyone, just face the facts. And the queen replied, which ones? There are just so many of them. Because intelligence is so tough, those who dedicate their lives to serving the nation in the intelligence realm deserve our highest admiration and respect. Samuel Goldwyn once said, "Allow me a few words before I begin to speak." Please, I ask you, allow me a few words before I end my speaking. And that is to tell you one final story about Reykjavik, that great weekend. And it happened 10 years after Reykjavik. The Iceland government had asked members of the delegation of the United States and the Soviet Union to come back 10 years later in October of 1996 and talk about everything that had gone on at the summit right there. I readily accepted, went to Reykjavik, and was just amazed at the explosion of emotion I felt going through that room and seeing what we had done in the afternoon, going through, sitting in the bubble where we had briefed the president, going over to the ambassador's house where the president had stayed, and we had lunch with him and then dinner, and going through the places at Reykjavik. I just was so moved that I went into a drugstore. I got a nice postcard of the Hofti House, where we had negotiated all night Saturday night from, I say, 8 o'clock at night till 6:20 in the morning. And knowing that President Reagan was then in the darkness of Alzheimer's, he had written that wonderful letter that we see here in the library in November of 1994, and this was about 2 years later, in 1996. Still, I wanted to write him a postcard, so I addressed it. I didn't have an address or anything. I addressed it, President Ronald Reagan, Los Angeles, California, USA. And I got some stamps and I mailed it. A week later, I was here at the library, and I saw Mrs. Reagan. And I went over to her and I said, "Mrs. Reagan, I was in Reykjavik last week, and I wrote your husband a postcard. And she looked at me like I was a little crazy. And she said, "You did?" And I said, "Yes, it was just such an emotional thing being there 10 years after the summit." And she says, "Well, what did you say in your postcard?" I said, "Mr. President, I'm back here at Reykjavik 10 years later, reliving the experience, and was just amazed to think back at what a sensational job you had done 12 years earlier on behalf of the country, and how exceptionally proud I was to have served you then. Sincerely, Ken Edelman." And I mailed it. I didn't know Nancy Reagan very well. She looked at me, and she started to cry a little bit. I started to do the same. Then I thought what a great honor it was in 7 years I was in the Reagan administration. Every time I walked into the White House, I had a chill in the back. My hair in the back of my neck stood out. I felt what an honor it is, and what a privilege to serve this great country. And I looked at Mrs. Reagan, and we were both moistened up there, and I said to her, "Boy, we were just lucky to have him, weren't we?" And she certainly agreed. Since that time, 15 years ago, it's no secret that Ronald Reagan was really a great president. It remains, however, a mystery where the music came from, that this fellow went and marched to a different drummer than everybody else at the time. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Ken. Now it is my pleasure. Also, I want to say thanks to Ken. He has to duck out here in a few minutes, so we appreciate his time spent with us. But now it's my pleasure to introduce the Deputy Director for Intelligence for Analytic Programs at the CIA. Peter Clement joined the agency in 1977 and spent much of his first 25 years focused on the Soviet Union. He later was a PDB briefer, President's Daily Brief, for then Vice President Cheney, as well as NSC Advisor Rice, and subsequently served as the DCI's representative to the U.S. mission to the United Nations before assuming his current duties. Mr. Clement holds a PhD in Russian history and an MA in European history. He is also an author and adjunct professor for many universities. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Clement.
Thank you very much, Duke. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a delight to find a lot of people who share a common love and interest in history. I'm a big history fan, and I'm especially glad to be here today to introduce our featured speaker. Now, there's a biography of Mr. Oleg Kalugin in your program on page 66, so I'm not actually going to walk through his career vita sheet. I would rather just tell you a short anecdote about my perspective on Mr. Kalugin. As you probably deduced, he's one of those rare individuals who we don't really get to see very much of because he was, in fact, a member of the KGB. He was a very senior member of the KGB. So when I was an analyst, a young analyst back in the 80s, during the Reagan years, looking at Soviet foreign policy, one of my tasks in my various accounts was to figure out why is it that the Soviets do what they do? What are their real policy intentions? What motivates them to do the various things they're doing? For example, say in the Third World. Why are they in Cuba or Angola or Mozambique or Ethiopia? And of course, being a diligent analyst, I decided I really need to get to the bottom of this, like, how do you get into people's minds? How do you find out what really motivates them? And in the course of my research, I discovered that actually many of the Soviet leaders in the Politburo got a lot of their information from the KGB, not only for managing domestic affairs, because one of their main functions was it is the Committee for State Security. It's security domestically. But they had a foreign intelligence arm called the First Chief Directorate. and that is the directorate in which Mr. Kalugin served. That directorate provided the Politburo a good deal of their knowledge and insight into what was going on in the rest of the world. So it occurred to a lot of us who were working on foreign policy accounts that to really understand a little bit about why Soviet leaders made the decisions they made, you better understand how the KGB operates, how it collects information, and how that information is presented to the senior leadership. And I'm going to stop there because I want to know the answer to that question when our featured speaker, Mr. Oleg Kalugin, speaks. And if you would come to the stage now, sir. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be a guest at the CIA-sponsored conference. In the old days, that was arch enemy, and I was involved heavily in fighting the CIA and trying to penetrate the organization. And I tell you, we did a good job before actually the CIA popped up on the public arena. Well, let me give you some figures which are not generally known. Before 1953, the Soviet intelligence handled over 300 assets inside the United States. In every single sphere of public, science, I mean, you name it. Well, Alger Hiss, by the way, who served in the State Department, had Henry Wallace become President of the United States, we would have Secretary of State, our main source, Alger Hiss. Well, it's no secret anymore. But we had wonderful, really, access to the Manhattan Project. I mean, the research and development of the atomic weapons. We had 12 sources inside the Manhattan Project. Well, what was good? Well, we did have a lot of stuff in that sense, we actually started to work against the United States before World War II. I cannot just forget one of the episodes in my career as a young officer in the KGB. Well, I was at that time Radio Moscow correspondent at the United Nations. So that was my next cover. The first one was a Fulbright scholar, Columbia University School of Journalism, where I recruited my first agent with access to classified information. Well, it was accidental almost, but anyway, it propelled my career. As I came to New York again, I was told by my superiors in Moscow to try to revive a good working relationship with one of the senior American journalists, really a top guy in the media in the United States. He used to serve in Moscow before World War II. And he was at that time contacted by the, well, NKVD or whatever it was called, Russian security services. And he told them at that time, it was on June 15th, I believe, of 1941, that Germans are going to attack Russia on June 22nd. It was immediately reported by the, well, NKVD, KGB, domestic service to Stalin. Stalin read the message and said, what a provocateur. He must be expelled. We are friends with Germany. And the next day, the guy was declared persona non grata and kicked out from the Soviet Union a week before the Germans invaded Russia. So, well, years later, as I say, I was in the United States, and I decided to, well, try to revive the relationship. They say he was a senior, figure in the United States in journalism, but very influential. So I call him and say, best regards from your old friends in Moscow. And I reminded some of the guys, and he said, if you call again, I'll call the FBI. You better. That was the end of it. And as I said, we had over 300, as I mentioned, sources, but they were mostly ideologically driven. They believed in socialism or communism, whatever, as the next, a future of humanity. And I myself, by the way, when I graduated from high school in 1952, I was a Stalinist. Stalin was alive. He was a great, victorious leader. And when he passed away on March 5th of 1953, I was in training at that time, foreign languages, English, German, Arabic, that would follow. And my mom called me and said, our dad passed away, and she was weeping really over the phone. I didn't understand. My father was a young man, relatively. Said, what do you mean? Our dad, Joseph, passed away. Oh, I went to the class and I said, Joseph Stalin. It was over the radio just in half an hour. Everyone cried. It was such a shock. And what a shock it was. Much worse. In 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev, in his infamous secret speech at the Party Congress, revealed the atrocities and brutality of Joseph Stalin, for all of us it was really a shock which we never revived from. The Soviet system, you cannot build a paradise on earth on the bones of millions of people. That was the novel thing about my own system. And from that moment on, of course I came to the United States. I was I think finished intelligence school, everything else, and I came as a Fulbright scholar, and my first impressions of the United States were based on my, education, upbringing. I came to the Times Square. I was just totally revolted by the vulgarity, low taste. I thought, Jesus, this is the United States. Next day I went to Bowery. You know what Bowery is? For New York, poverty. Jesus says, this is the country. A symbol of human, future? No way. And I became even more dedicated communist than ever. Well, later I would have a good career as a Radio Moscow correspondent at the United Nations. I recruited, 7 Americans. One of them, by the way, had access to information which would make a really historic, it was a historic value. It's access to solid fuel for missiles. The so-called Thiokol Chemical Corporation, some of you may have heard of that company in the old days, but that was years ago. Later, when as a correspondent to Radio Moscow, I recruited some Americans. One of them, for instance, this might be interesting for you, had no access to anything classified. At some point, he was a member of the United States Communist Party, but when Stalin and Hitler made a pact of friendship, he quit and would just stay away. I met his young son who worked for a nuclear lab at Columbia University, and he professed to be a socialist. So I said, okay, why don't you write a piece for me about the life of American students who have to work and study? And he said, okay. So I thought, good, that's the guy I'll have in mind. Well, when we met a week later, he came empty-handed. I said, what's wrong? I said, well, you're a Soviet, I'm an American. I said, what's wrong? He said, you're a socialist. You're a fake. Well, I said, I'm sorry. He walked away. A week later, I walked somewhere in Broadway area near Columbia University campus, and I'm approached by a man in his late 40s or early 50s, and I thought I was an FBI. He said, you are Mr. Kalugin. I said, yeah, what can I do for you? Well, listen, don't touch my son. I said, oh, what do you mean? Well, you tried to recruit my son. I said, what are you talking about? No, I said, come on. Listen, just leave him alone. I'll work for you. I said, what do you mean? I will work for you. I know what you want. I said, okay, what can you do for us? Well, I was young, inexperienced, and later when I reported to Moscow, they said that was a fake. He was an FBI plant. He didn't. I said, well, but he looked sincere. Well, anyway, you know what? Indeed, he never had access to anything classified, but he was one of the most trusted agents in my time. He would do a lot of things. He would travel out the country as an American. He would establish or renew contacts with some of the lost sources, but he had a more perhaps important mission in case the war was imminent between the United States and the USSR. one of his missions was to blow up power lines, electric lines in Washington, D.C. or New York area, and, well, poison water supplies. Well, not to kill people, but just to make them, sort of uneasy. Well, I mean, simple things, but that was part of the mission of that man, and he, well, fortunately, thank God, he never had to do that. But that was just one of the old days when we really thrived on ideology. When well, one of the guys, what may be interesting to you, was a high school kid, a graduate. And he was fingered by one of the old members of the United States Communist Party. He said, Oleg, why don't you meet this young man? He wants to become a member of the Communist Party. Talk to him. So I meet this young man. So you want to become a member of the United States Communist Party? Are you serious? He said, oh, yeah. I said, well, okay, do you know that the Communist Party is totally infiltrated and controlled by the FBI? Oh, no, come on. I said, well, I know it's what I tell you. But if you do really want to become a member, why don't you fill out the form, application, give it to me. I'll pass it to Moscow. They'll keep it in a safe, good place, and you'll be a secret member of the Communist Party. He's all right. I said, oh, yeah, that's great. So he was, can you imagine, a graduate of high school, but later we would develop a good working relationship when he grew up and became a mature man. Well, I'm talking about these small things. They are important for intelligence business. But let me tell you, Khrushchev's speech delivered a mortal blow to ideals of communism. And when I came to Washington as deputy chief of the KGB residence and later acting chief of station, and we really felt pressures and which would be later picked up by great President Reagan. By the way, it was Mr. Gorbachev who called President Kennedy a great president. That doesn't happen often, when a Soviet leader would call an American president a great leader. Well, anyway, I came to Washington, and there were no ideological spies anymore. Illusions were all just destroyed. And we would just capitalize on, well, those who wanted to make money. Well, I will just mention one case because it may be interesting how you treat intelligence and what may happen. John Walker was one of the guys who I have in mind. He was a totally, money-motivated guy, and he was a volunteer, and we befriended him, and he would work for the next nearly 20 years and recruited his son and, brother-in-law. I mean, he was, well, anyway, in 1968, I'm acting chief of KGB station in Washington. And August 21st, I believe, the Soviet troops are about to move into Czechoslovakia to crush the, kind of anti-socialist elements. And I receive a cable from Moscow saying that inform the ambassador. Anatoly Dobrynin was the Soviet ambassador at that time for many years, actually 20 years or so. Never became minister because he was distrusted to live too long in the United States. So I come to Ambassador Dobrynin and show him the cable that tomorrow the troops of the Warsaw Pact Treaty will enter to Czechoslovakia to crush the anti-Soviet CIA-sponsored revolt. Well, that was really a moment. I have access to John Walker's information, classified from all over the intelligence community of the United States, except the FBI. By the way, J. Edgar Hoover kept the organization in good shape. We had everywhere, but not in the FBI at that time. There was one attempt with Judith Kaplan, but that was years before. Well, so I give this cable to Ambassador Dobrynin. And he reads it, looks at me, I look at him. Silence. And then for the first time in my life, I say, fools, the ambassador's response, idiots. That's how we became friends. Can you imagine? The acting chief of station of the KGB and the Soviet ambassador called their leadership fools and idiots. Well, that did not prevent me from my career because no one knew we were, good friends for. And, what happened on the way to success? When I became chief of foreign counterintelligence, which is a major branch of the Soviet KGB and remains for today, we had 160 foreign assets. Primarily, our job was to, just name it briefly, the penetration of all security and intelligence organizations of the world, the CIA, FBI, number one, everyone else. Well, in fact, let me tell you, as I mentioned, in the United States, we had over 300 agents. Total numbers, Soviet sources. The next country was France, 160. The third country was India, 150. And the fourth was United Kingdom, over 50. Well, some of the guys, Kim Philby, George Blake, well, I supervised them, not in London, but in Moscow. But so I'm well familiar with that part of the work of treating former employees or officials of the foreign secrets, how to keep them happy. Some of them were not quite happy. Some would drink a lot and then commit suicide. A guy by name Barnett, if I recall correctly, Barnett. Anyway, in Moscow I became chief of foreign counterintelligence, and we managed to increase our agents, sources network to more than 500. 2/3 of them were members of foreign intelligence and counterintelligence organizations, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Those creations of the CIA, we tried to penetrate and to, redirect them and get some information from the inside. The chief of the Russian section of Radio Liberty, which also broadcast to Eastern Europe, would become a Soviet agent, the chief of the Russian section of Radio Liberty. When I became a public figure at some point in my life in the USSR and denounced the KGB, that guy was already back in Russia because he was to be arrested. And he denounced me public as a traitor. And I called him, listen, you were working for the KGB for so many years. I'm not surprised that you now call me a traitor, but I worked more than you did. In that sense, no comparison between, London and Paris and whatever, London. Well, anyway, foreign counterintelligence, 4 major functions: the penetration of foreign intelligence, counterintelligence organizations. Second, the penetration of all emigre organizations, Russian, Ukrainian, Baltic states, whoever. And one of the best penetrations we made at the time, and it's still going on, the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, you must understand that the Russian Orthodox Church, survived and adjusted itself to the Soviet and post-Soviet regime because they collaborated. I'll give you one just simple example because it would take too long. Many years later, when I became a public figure, and I said this is what I've told you about the Russian Church association with the security and KGB, and I publicly called a Patriarch Alexei, Moscow Patriarch, a KGB informer. His response was interesting. He invited me to dinner at his home, and 2 of us were just a servant would provide, all the stuff. And he would tell me, and that's probably interesting, he said, listen, I was an informer, that's correct. But you know what, you're a young man, and I'll tell you something. The Russian Orthodox Church, after the Communist Revolution, 1/3 had to emigrate, the other 1/3 were jailed and executed. The third, they had to adjust to realities. I had to survive, and this is how we promote the church. And I'm just talking about that because in the old days, The Soviet system was built on three pillars. Number one, the Communist Party, KGB. Number two, the military-industrial complex, number three. Today, there is a difference. On top of the state and everything stands the KGB. Well, that never happened in the history of mankind. The organization with the reputation of the KGB is now running the country. Nearly 1,000 senior employees of the Kremlin administration, well, including, of course, Mr. Putin himself, who was one of my subordinates, they are former KGB officers or, well, informers. 1,000 employees, what would you expect from the country which is, well, of that kind of penetration? Well, some of the guys would say it publicly. I was rather cautious in my public pronouncements, but one of them, he died of poisoning in London, but that was his personal attack on Mr. Putin. I'm talking about Mr. Litvinenko, who was poisoned. Another young lady, Anna Politkovskaya, who raised her voice against this Russian intervention in Chechnya. By the way, I was also against that intervention, and I stated it publicly. Let them go. Where would they go? South to Armenia, Azerbaijan? No, they would have to deal with Russia anyway. Stop that war. That was one of the major clashes with the current regime, and well, no wonder at some point Mr. Putin called me a traitor. I called him a war criminal, and I'll say that he will face the, like Mr. Milosevic of Yugoslavia, I mean, who would end as a war criminal because of what he did to, in Kosovo. Well, anyway, back to the old days, Gorbachev, when he came to power, he really revived and resurrected hopes in the, development of Russia on a different path. All before that, and I said, because of my internal criticism and because I was suspecting of being a CIA agent of influence, I'm very proud, that was released later on, that I was recruited by the CIA in 1958, I believe, that's correct, together with another guy by name Alexander Yakovlev, who was also a student. He was a World War II veteran, older than me, 10 years older. He was also at Columbia, and we were both recruited by the CIA, and from that moment on, we would try to push the Soviets out of the way and provide, free road to the CIA. Well, in that sense, and I'm going back to President Reagan, played a tremendous role. He would always say plainly and clearly, and when I remember that so well, tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev, despite their friendly, open relationship. And Gorbachev was really attached in a very human way. I mean, no wonder he was suspected at some point. He was too friendly with the United States and would later be denounced, Gorbachev, as traitor. He's actually called sometimes a traitor. No one knows. But, that's the thing which happened. But before Gorbachev would fall in that category of traitors, when I spoke openly for reforms inside the KGB, and my experience in the United States was not a waste of time, I learned that in a free country you have to have several organizations dealing with security and intelligence. You cannot combine them in one fist, because that one fist is a road to dictatorship, and that's exactly what happened in Russia. Only NKVD or KGB, no one else. The GRU, military intelligence, was all infested with KGB informers. They would not, and the Defense Department as well. They would not move around freely. We would be in charge in the end. Well, in the United States, these 5 different organizations, and that was my idea, and offered it to when I became sort of vocal, I said, we have to split the KGB into. Well, I'm very happy to say that it did happen. We now have, Russia, SVR, Russian Intelligence Service, FSB, Russian Domestic equivalent to the FBI. I mean, though it was 500,000 altogether, now it's a small organization. I mean, much smaller. Well, of course, an equivalent of the National Security Agency. I mean, all these eavesdropping, I mean, decoding foreign intelligence, I mean, all sorts of diplomatic traffic, and of course, border guards and personal security, the 9th so-called directorate, which is the Presidential Security Service in the United States. So, you know, well, but in the former USSR, it was overblown out of proportions, and I offered to, well, make it just squeeze out and, well. As a result, Mr. Gorbachev said, and others, that I was a traitor. I was charged with treason for my public, that's it. And I was stripped of my rank and decorations. I was summoned to the military prosecutor, and a miracle happened. On the day I was to appear at the military prosecutor, face charges of treason, I was registered as a candidate to the Russian parliament. And I obtained immunity from prosecution. From that moment on, I would become even more vocal, and I would travel around the world, in the United States and Europe and all over, and would say what I'm saying to you now. And that was, you know, years ago. Well, in the end, as you know, Gorbachev was hated by the KGB, really. Oh, they did hate him because he introduced some of those liberal reforms. He was really an honest, sincere man. I know, I'm not surprised that they found a common, I mean, grounds and a human touch with President Reagan. I mean, he wanted to reform the country without losing the, you know, great, I mean, communist ideals. But he did not understand what I said earlier. You cannot build a paradise on earth on the bones of millions of people, and he wanted to change, but he would bump into great opposition from the military, from the KGB. And, well, when I spoke, I mean, openly about that, he issued a decree stripping me of everything. I was charged, as I told you. Well, later on, after the August events of 1991, when Gorbachev came back to power, fully reinstated, happy, I was invited to the Kremlin reception, I mean, by Gorbachev, I mean, personally. And he just apologized, shook my hand, and I was so happy listening back to everything. And I'll tell you honestly, I did not understand, I did not realize, I mean, that 6 weeks later, the USSR will just exist no more. Yeltsin will emerge as the leader of the Russian Federation and all other republics, Baltic states, I mean, Ukraine, Central Asia, I mean, Belarus, I mean, they all became independent. That was the beginning of a new era. And I was really appalled. I did not really mean that. I thought the more solidarity, internationalism we have, wherever we live, that's good for, well, for the whole world. But the dissolution of the Soviet system was a fact of life. And well, now, my former subordinate, I mentioned Mr. Putin, Vladimir, who never worked in the intelligence one day. That's a major misconception, I mean, primarily made by the Soviet propaganda. The only place abroad he ever worked was in Dresden, East Germany. He was liaison officer between Russian KGB and, well, Stasi, the East German Security and Intelligence Service, and that was in Dresden. When he came back to Leningrad, St. Petersburg, where I was born, we were born actually in the same block almost, I mean, Mr. Putin and I. Well, he was never accepted back to work. Well, the reasons are generally known. Well, and I said again, if you read the Litvinenko files and the fact that he was poisoned, he revealed on the internet, made it public, some of the ugly things from Mr. Putin's personal life. I'm not going to say about that. That's, after all, not the point. What is the point that Gorbachev, when he emerged from, you know, and he made a first time an opening to the West, and he found a common, I mean, a friend, and probably kind of a mental or soul with President Reagan. That was really something of a, well, of a great event in the history of the two countries and probably worldwide. And I recall in the early 80s when President Reagan publicly mentioned the so-called Star War program. That's what it was called. The Soviets were in dismay. This is a warmonger here. We have to take everything to get rid of him. And, well, as it turns out, President Reagan was a practical, really pragmatic guy who had his own ideas and who wanted to finish with this system of slavery. And, whatever, it was a Russian system without a single shot. That's, I think Margaret Thatcher said that. The Soviet system fell apart without a single shot. And Reagan played a tremendous role in bringing down the Soviet system. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there is a growing restoration of the Soviet, not in the worst ways, system in current Russia. And this is what you have to bear in mind. The Soviet intelligence have been revived. And as I said earlier about the three pillars, of the old days, the three pillars are KGB, as I said, number one, Russian Orthodox Church, number two, Russian business. People who are willing to collaborate. If they do not, they are in London, like Mr. Berezovsky, the godfather of Mr. Putin, by the way. Mr. Berezovsky, Boris, a well-known billionaire, and I met in Washington one day years ago, and he told me how he